Choung, welcome to Apollos Watered.
Thanks.
Are you ready for the Fast Five?
Maybe. Give it to me.
Okay, here we go. We got to get the Fast Five started. And the first question is, we're going to just start off really basic. Okay, here we go. iPhone or Android? Real basic.
Oh, easy. iPhone.
That's iPhone, easy. That's an easy one for you. Good. Why?
Oh,
Tell me why. Tell me why.
I'm kind of an Apple fan over here. There was a time when I used to joke about like, I'm an evangelist for two things, Jesus and Apple. So I do like it a lot. So we're deep in the whole family. There's nothing PC or Android in this house.
Not allowed. It's like
not allowed.
Not even dating. Not even dating.
No. Once you know, you got to say no to everything else, Travis.
Once you go Mac, you never go back. Is that it?
I guess that's how it is.
Is that how it is? We're gonna go back. You don't go back. Okay. Now you're out in California. You've been in Boston. So here we go. Okay. Boston, Southern California.
Oh, that's brutal. Oh man. But Boston folks, forgive me. I do have to say Southern California. Southern California is it's pretty nice over here. It's pretty nice.
I don't even know why that's a contest. Have you? I mean, I've been in California in the winter. I've been in Boston in the winter. This is not a contest.
Well, growing up in Boston, I spent my 20s in the Boston area. So like late teens, 20s. Man, that's a great place to do that. Right.
It is.
And fond memories, like my best friends come from that time. It's a pretty powerful time for me. But yeah. If you're just going climate or just sheer comfort, it's hard to be Southern California. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in Boston, the traffic there made me question my salvation.
Oh yeah, they don't care about anything out there, right? Like lights or the lines on the road. None of that matters. Right? None of it.
And the streets don't make any sense. They make no sense. It's like someone took spaghetti, threw it up in the air, and wherever it landed, that's how they drew the city lines in the streets.
Oh, that's right. That whole joke about like when you're asking for directions and people are like, can't get there from here, right? Like that's it's crazy. Yeah, there was no city planning at that time.
I love the fact that you have the accent. That's the best part of it. Because I was at church one Sunday and I had to get the bubbler. I had to go to the bubbler to get the carrot. It's all that stuff from Boston. I had to pick up all those.
That's words. Right. You're packing your car.
That's right. Yeah. You got to pack your car. But it was fun. I tried to preach like that once. I don't think it went over very well.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Neither of us being Boston natives. Yeah. I hope we haven't offended New England people all across the board now.
We probably
They've just turned off already. Yeah.
Here we go. Next one.
Okay.
You've done your traveling. Now, strangest food you have ever eaten.
Oh man, that's tough. That I'm trying to think of something. Nothing's coming right to mind. Strangest food. It's a great question. And I don't think I've got anything that crazy. Chicken feet, that's pretty normal.
Chicken what?
Chicken feet, like Chinese food. When you go to dim sum, you could eat chicken feet. Or man, I'm blanking out. But when I was in Korea, they tried to make me eat dog stew. That was almost a thing. But the Korean pastors, they love to watch the Americans like squirm a bit. So I am of Korean descent, but I've never had dog stew, boshingtang, and I was like, oh, so almost ate that, but didn't have that.
I was with a group of Filipinos in a Filipino Bible study, and they were doing the same thing, trying to get me to eat balut, which is a fried duck egg where the duck's half formed and it's got the beak and the feathers. Mm-hmm. And they were all laughing through the entire thing. Yeah. And the younger Filipinos in the group are like, I'm not touching it.
Yeah,
So I get it.
Blood sausage. I've had blood sausage. That's a Korean delicacy. Yes. Oh. It's just like intestine that wraps around noodles that are soaked in blood. That's gnarly. That is wow. Trying to stifle down the gag reflex was pretty brutal.
Okay, here we go. Next question.
Okay.
Now you said you've grown up, Korean American, but you still we all have those cultural experience when we interact with different people, different ethnic backgrounds. What's your most embarrassing cultural moment that you can share on the air?
Most I try to block that stuff out. Most embarrassing cultural moment. There was one. So I grew up in Seattle, and from the second grade to the 12th grade, went to predominantly Black school. So it'd be African American would be the majority, but they would also be pretty multi-ethnic.
Okay.
And I decided as a transfer into this high school, so Garfield High School, for those who know Seattle, proud historic Black high school, like Jimi Hendrix, Quincy Jones are alumni.
Wow. Okay.
Also Bruce Lee. But yeah, it's this very historic kind of high school. And I decided to run for class president. And which, I was like, hey, what? I had it kind of backwards. I kind of wanted to try to be popular. So I ran for president. You're supposed to actually do that the other way around. So I ran, and I ran against someone who would eventually be my prom date. She was great. But then so I went up and I decided, so imagine Korean American guy decided that Jesse Jackson spoke at our high school twice while we were there. So we get big name speakers. So I decided I was going to give my speech in the style of Jesse Jackson. So you can imagine, right? 14 years old, I'm doing it, and I'm going for it. And actually, the crazy thing about it is it's sort of working, So we're the Garfield Bulldogs. We're like nicknamed, we're the doghouse. So I said, if you don't vote for me, instead of being in the doghouse, we're going to be in the poorhouse, right? And the whole crowd starts barking. It's kind of working. And I'm taking the speech up to this crescendo, right? And so when we're seniors, and I'm just rattling off all the list of things we're going to do. We're going to have our prom at the West End. They're like, yeah! We're going to have a cruise around Elliott Bay. And they're like, yeah! And to top it all off, so I'm building up. And when we're done at the end of the year, we're going to go to Wild Waves. Now, Wild Waves is a water slide park that's in Federal Way, a little bit south of Seattle. And little did I know that would not connect with an urban inner city high school crew. So I go, Wild Waves. I'm expecting the cheer. The place goes silent. And then after that, they started crumpling up paper and throwing paper, booing me off, laughing. I couldn't even finish the speech. And when I got off the stage, like I was the social leper for a week. No one wanted to talk to me. My friends were avoiding me. Before the vote was out, people were like, maybe there's next year, man. Like just brutal. So I bid it pretty big. Yeah.
Oh, that's an awesome story. I love that. That is so good. And I actually get the Jesse Jackson style. I'm a huge fan of E.V. Hill. And I have imitated, he has one sermon that I've listened to like 100 times. And I have imitated him over the years because his cadence, his delivery is just so good. And sometimes it would creep into my sermons and I didn't even realize it. And people would be like,
turn it down.
And I'm like, that is me. I love him. Anyway. Okay, here we go. If your life were a movie, who would be the main character and why?
My life for a movie, who would be the main character and why? Yeah, and this will be weird. I'm named after James Bond.
Are you serious?
People, it's like, no, you're not kidding. No, I really am. My dad read James Bond novels when he was growing up in Korea, learning English, and so he named me after James Bond. And I go, why would you name me after like someone who kills people and womanizes? And he goes, no. James also is in the Bible. James the disciple. But my brother Gerald was not named after anyone in scripture. Named after the president at the time. So so I'm actually named after James Bond. And I so then father son tradition, and we're both believers. He became a pastor after me, but we still to this day. Opening day, we're going to go to a James Bond movie. When it comes out in the theaters, we'll see it together. And that's tradition. Or not necessarily opening day, but we will wait so that we can see it together. So James Bond. But it also has like spiritual significance. There was a time I was reading Wild at Heart by Eldridge, right? That's kind of when it was popular at the time. And there's this part in the book where he says, why don't you ask God for a new name? What's the name that he's giving you, to be wild at heart? So I remember doing this exercise because my buddy did it, and he heard servant of the poor, which actually led him to become a missionary in Cambodia. And so I said, okay, sure. I sat there, and as I was praying about it, I heard your name is James. And I go, that's so boring. That's already my name. Can it be like something else, like James Bond or something else like that? And what God says is, no, James. And he reminded me, in the Hebrew, it's Jacob. It's one who grasps the heel, or one who overthrows.
Okay.
And then the invitation from the Father was, this is pretty vulnerable. The invitation was that I'll use you to overthrow the kingdoms of this world.
Oh, that's cool.
For my sake. And
that's
you can
awesome.
join. So I get to join in the kingdom of God, and it's advanced. So James Bond is the fun one that I would relate to, but then there is a James part that's also more connected to me.
So my name means toll taker at a crossroads.
Really?
I need a new name, man. I need
toll taker at a crossroads.
It's like, this is horrible, you know? And then I remember when my kids were born, someone says, "Are you going to give them a Bible name?" I said, "Yep, Isaiah's son, Mahir Shalal Hashbaz." It means swift to the booty, speedy to the prey.
That's great.
And my kids, because I was in the inner city of Chicago, they're like, "What?" So I was like, no, not that.
Well, that's great. I mean, you could be like the toll taker at the crossroads. You like, imagine you in a robe, you've got a giant scythe, and you're standing there, kind of like the Grim Reaper. And it's like, pay your toll. And confronting them with the major decisions of their lives.
I guess, yeah. There's a lot more names that I think are a lot prettier, but that's okay.
Other names.
That's okay. The names there, man. That's pretty good. All right. So we've got this. But you never said. So James Bond.
I'll go with James Bond. Yeah. Just trying to do the sneaky thing.
But I mean, who would play the part? Not would it be after? So if your name were a movie, who would play your character?
Who would play my character? Yeah. Which actor would play my character?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wow. That's a great. It'd be Kevin Hart. No, I'm just kidding. Who would play me? That's a great question. I totally heard you wrong on that. And
that's okay.
Man, who would it be? Maybe it's I'm just thinking of total stereotypes, right? The kid who helped Short Round that helped Indiana Jones? Is it gonna be there aren't that many about our age. Asian American,
Yeah.
There aren't that many Asian Americans who would be out there. So
there's some great actors out there though.
There are though. Yeah,
there's more. That Marvel.
It could be that guy from. Yeah.
The Marvel superhero series. Yeah, I don't remember his name either.
Maybe the guy who's in Crazy Rich Asians. That guy can, he can definitely up my image.
Okay.
That's a good looking brother.
Okay, so let's hear your story, because you talk about that in your book, Longing for Revival. I read the book, and I mean, actually, you finish it off with a story about your family. I want to hear your story for a bit. I mean, you're Korean American, but your story really starts going back actually a couple generations, and it's really unique in how it goes to revival. So share that with us. Share your story and how it really related to revival, because it's pretty cool.
Yeah. There's a story as related. There's a young shaman, and she is the spiritual leader of a village about 50 miles north of Pyongyang, in a small village called Yeongmi. And she was the leader of the tree shrine, and that's where the people in the village worshipped. But she lost her first two children when they were young, and so she got so mad at the tree shrine, she cut it down and defecated on it. I mean, I just imagine like angry Korean woman, just you let me down, and that's a dangerous thing to let a
Korean woman down.
So she was so angry that happened, and I sort of imagine her then. She's like sort of sitting near the tree and just mad, just stewing in that. And kind of at the time, a missionary meets her. This is a missionary who has just experienced the Pyongyang revivals and is sent north from the revivals as a missionary. And this missionary meets this young shaman and tells her that there's God has come to her, there's Jesus, and that you can believe in him, that he is the forgiver of sins and can be the savior and leader of your life. And she goes, she becomes a follower of Jesus at that point. And then what she does is then, because she becomes a Christian, basically almost the whole village becomes Christian, and she plants the first church in this community. That shaman is my great-great-grandmother. And then my great-grandfather sort of was a leader in that church. My grandparents met at that church. My dad was infant baptized in this church since he was born in the north part of Korea. It wasn't North Korea at the time, but geographically now is North Korea. And from that point, right, so that's my heritage. I'm a spiritual generation descendant of the Pyongyang revivals, and didn't know this until like as I was writing the book. That
really?
sort of came to me. I didn't know the story at all. Wasn't planning. I just thought the way we found out about it was crazy, actually. So I've already written most of the book with Ryan, and I'm looking for an epilogue. And I'm thinking my family story is connected to Pyongyang. Almost every Protestant Korean story is connected to Pyongyang in some way. So I'm just assuming my family has a story. I hadn't yet figured out what that story was. So then I was talking to my dad, and I said, so Dad, how are we connected to Pyongyang revivals? And he goes, we're not, And I went, what? I almost looked at him funny. He said it so like, certainly we're not connected to it at all. I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about. So this is me talking to my dad. So I go, Dad, can you like call our family and find out if we have a connection? Because I don't believe you. I mean, we're Protestants, so there's got to be some connection to this thing. So then he gets on the phone and starts calling his family. And that's where he finds out this story for the first time. He's in his 70s. Yeah, he's in his 70s when he's heard the first story for the first time. So he couldn't wait to tell me. And, and it was amazing. So both of us heard the story around the same time and this history. And my family was surprised that my dad didn't know because he's the firstborn son. Yeah. I'm the firstborn son of the firstborn son of the firstborn son, right? So it's sort of, we are the leaders of our family's generation, right? That generation in our family. So he didn't know about it, but now, so it was encouraging to him. And so then to hear like the stories of church plants in our family, my grandfather, then as he had to run from the communists, and he escapes from what is now known as North Korea in this really Hollywood-like story, using his wits, getting his family across the river. There's so much to tell about that. Then ends up in Busan, the southern coast of Korea, and there plants a church, which still exists today. And then goes up to Seoul a few years later with his friends. They planted another church there. That still exists today, right? And then my dad, sort of as he immigrates to America, Arkansas, Chicago, then ends up Seattle, helps a fledgling church plant there, gives birth to me, and then I get to be a part of a couple church plants. So it's this crazy way that the Lord has sort of given us an inheritance. There's a legacy that's been passed down, and we had no idea. But once we heard the stories, we're like, oh, that kind of makes sense, right?
Wow.
Such a deep Christian heritage in our family.
But that's so impressive. And you hear about that, how God is faithful to those who fear him, to like 1,000 generations. And that's so encouraging to be able to have that. And I would also think what I know about a Korean heritage or a Korean just mind with the ancestors and how ancestors are valued, especially within other cultures, but to see that spiritual Christian ancestor heritage would even be more amplified, I would think, and more honorable, which is really, really amazing. And so your family's been involved in revival for some time. And you write this book, Longing for Revival, with the subtitle, and I love this, From Holy Discontent to Breakthrough Faith. Because I think everyone gets the discontent. But what was the impetus to write this book? It wasn't about your grandmother defecating on a tree that she cut down, which I'd like to know how that story got passed down. And that was a story that's, by the way, kids, let me tell you about grandma.
Yeah. Well, apparently they did. My dad just did the story. But yeah, it's funny, and it's really ironic because, and I think I mentioned in the book, it's my first ever talk outside of my ministry when I was invited to speak somewhere else was actually against revival. Like I made it a point to just preach against it because, I grew up hearing about revival all the time.
Same here.
Totally makes sense. I didn't know why, but in Korean churches, they talk about it a lot. Everything that isn't on Sunday is like a revival meeting or a revival gathering, or it's tacked onto everything you do. A retreat is called a revival. And I didn't know, to me, it just felt like they were just trying to drum up my emotions or it felt manipulative to me, the way they kept using this word to try to stir me up into some stronger devotion for faith. So I grew up really with a negative attachment to that word because it was just around me all the time. So then that's why I went and gave this first talk of like, don't seek revival, just be faithful, right? The king's already here, which you can imagine, like in some ways there's a truth to that, but I really went out of my way to try to dress down revival. So it's sort of fast forward a long time, and this is Ryan Pfeiffer and we're in San Diego. We're seeing revival playing out on campus, and it's just God moving and people becoming Christian by the droves. It was a wild time and a wild season, and so he's the one that really was talking it back into my ear. And I just remember every time he brought it up, I'm like, come on, man, why do we need to talk about revival? Let's just have people be faithful, you know. But as we kept talking, as we went along, there were just some dynamics about what it meant to seek revival, why the word might be important. All of a sudden, it just started to take on more and more weight as we went along. And maybe then, as we were thinking about it, could we write a book that would be like revival for the rest of us? Because revival literature can go on to some extremes. It could be like really academic on one end. And so you're just going through the history of it and see how that kind of plays itself out. Or it goes way the other end, you know, like with eagles and fire on the cover, and you know, just for a lot of mainstream, I guess, Christians, wherever you want, that just feels like this really edgy kind of thing. And we're wondering, maybe revival actually is a term we can redeem and find a way to say, maybe there's something about revival for the rest of us. What would this look like? And just try to unpack it in everyday language in a way that would make it something that would seem like something we should do and something that we could seek, and sort of lean into the psalmist's prayer in Psalm 85 of, would you revive us, O Lord, so that people may rejoice in you. That was really the impetus to do that. And then there were some dynamics that we were identifying that thought maybe this would be helpful to getting more people around the table to long for revival together.
Well, then you go on to not only just long for revival, but you then define it, which I really appreciated. And you say it's a season of breakthroughs in word, deed, and power that ushers in a new normal of kingdom experience and fruitfulness. Yep. Now, hearing that, you have those three different categories: word, deed, and power. Why is it so important for us to understand it as breakthroughs in word, deed, and power? And why should we see it as a new normal? Now, I know I don't want to take away from the book because you guys unpack that over several chapters. But just briefly, why, I mean, really even why that definition in word, deed, and power and ushering in a new normal? Why is that so important for us to understand?
Yeah, because it brings in a balance. The word, deed, and power, and so the biblical basis for that would be around Romans 15, where when Paul talked about fully proclaiming the gospel, there's a part where that full proclamation meant some geography that he was walking around in the text, but also it gives a qualitative picture of that. And you'll see Paul, as he talks about his own ministry, he says he does it in word, deed, and power. And you'll see that language showing up there. And we have also found that it sort of came out of our way of trying to invite people into a wider view of witness when we were in San Diego together. Just to say, like, witness isn't just word, it's word, deed, and power, and holding that together created more space for people to be involved in witness rather than it having to look a particular way. So why that's important with revival, particularly with word, deed, and power, folks, is that most of us identify more deeply with one of the circles, maybe two, but we tend to identify more with one. And left to our own devices, we will judge the other circles. So if you're a word-centered person, you look at a deed person who might be involved in justice or compassion, right? You look at them and you're like, well, they just seem angry. Why aren't they like staying in the scriptures? Or, you know, you're looking at the power people and they're just looking like they're shaking and baking. They're rolling around the aisles. But how are they grounded in the word? You know, let's stay grounded in the word. Whereas if you're like a deed person and you're looking at a word person and you're like, hey, you just look like you're so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. Why not get in the dirt and really love people? Or they'll look at the power people. It's like, that's great that you're doing that in your closet, but hey, there's a lot of needs to meet today. And on the power side, right? Like you look at the word person and you're going like, they have a form of godliness that seems to deny his power, right? Or power people look at the deed folks and go, you know, there's the joy of the Lord, experience him, you know, Don't worry about all the stuff that's happening in the world today. And there's a way that because of our either temperament or spiritual gifting, that there's a way that we'll look down on the other circles. And we just found that we need a unifying concept to say, actually, no matter where you are on this grid of the 3 circles, your invitation is always to come to the center where they overlap and to do that in love. And then when we looked at histories of revival, that often revivals will enter in one circle, but as they tend to mature, often, much of the time, you'll find them sort of incorporating the other pieces as they go along, right? Where there's the Wesleyans with the Methodists, right? There's a word component to this strong thing, but then so the deed part, they really focused on the miners. They, like actual coal miners, right? The actual blue collar, not right. Yeah. And Wesley himself had a little more disdain for the elite, really wanted to kind of lift up those who were more marginalized. But also then things were happening in parts of his community where in prayer, they were experiencing God. There were things that were happening in the experience in the power circle. And you can see that those, you might start with one, like the Methodists starting with word, or maybe like the Franciscans starting more with the deed and loving the poor, but seeing how that plays out in a communal Bible study and how that also played out into these powerful ecstatic experiences. That there was something about, you could start one way, but as it matured, it sort of had a way of bringing people in. And of course, there's the bet, and sort of that's what we're trying to guard is there are revivals that run into just halt or skid out because they don't know how to welcome the other circles. And they sort of burn out or spin out or don't come to where it could have gone. And so we are trying to find a way to welcome and say, like, it doesn't have to look a particular way, but the invitation is always to come to the middle where word, deed, and power are overlapping in love.
Now, hearing that, and trying to put together a little bit of your bio, because you mentioned your dad being baptized as an infant. So I'm assuming that he comes from, because I know Presbyterians are huge within Korea. Right. But yet you mentioned your home church, which is the Gardena Baptist Church, right?
Valley Baptist, yep.
Yeah. And then you mentioned in your bio, though, you said you're ordained in the Vineyard movement. So I'm like, that's okay, right. That's really 3 different groups of people.
Sure. That's right.
So I'm looking at that. I'm like, how does that play? Because I think he's fighting with himself.
Yeah, that's fair.
I mean, but it seems like it does. Because I mean, coming from because we all have those backgrounds that we come from, and I'm more from a word background, but I recognize that there's a part that's missing. I had a friend of mine, Charlie Davis, used to be the head of team. He wrote a book called Slider Switches. Actually, I don't know if he calls it that. It might be multi-ethnic, multicultural discipleship, but in it, he uses the metaphor of slider switches. And he says, within a culture, some cultures are high on the experience and low on the knowledge. And he said, you got to turn that up. And every culture has to have their own setting, like singers on a stage. Yeah. And I love that. I love that because I think that the gospel confirms something in every culture, and then it challenges something in every culture. And it's learning from other people in those cultures so that my view of God can expand. So I know I'm much more word-centered, but I know that the Spirit does things that I don't always am comfortable with. I mean, even just looking at the scriptures, he chooses a teenage girl to bring forth the Messiah. God has a way of operating some outside of my comfort zone. The hard part is when do I say that is out of bounds? I mean, we have the biblical parameters, but sometimes there's the gray areas. And even some of the stuff that you guys wrote in here, I was like, oh no, I don't know where I'm at with that. Like prophetic stuff. And I'm not against it. I'm open to it. But my Baptistic conservative root starts freaking out a little bit, and I get a little bit nervous. But that seems like it's also kind of what you guys want to do, is to say, okay, let's rethink this a little bit. Let's broaden our parameters a little bit. Is that what you guys are trying to do a bit, to say, let's rethink how we can have revival? And it's not always going to fall within our parameters. Matter of fact, we've been doing it in our parameters for a while and we haven't had revival. Is that what you guys are
absolutely
trying to do?
We definitely want to, there's a humility, and we write about the humility that's needed, right? Like to be able to chew on the meat but spit out the bones. So
you mentioned that.
And there's got to be something where we're learning, and a place where God gets to surprise us, right? If it's everything going along to our strategy, then we don't get to experience what that verb in the book of Acts, where it's just constantly the sense of being amazed. They were amazed. They were amazed. And they got to see God moving. So we do want to create space for the others to be at the table. And so here's the other side of it, though. If you don't create the space, so let's say you, and this is my background too, but I'm much more of a word-centered background. My sort of connection with the vineyard comes late, like basically end of college, post-college. If you do not create spaces for that kind of either experience or power, right, where it can be kind of either protected or guided by the word, right? If you don't do it, people are going to seek it somewhere else. And then how well off are they if they seek it somewhere else? Like that's actually worse because it's not being grounded in the scripture. Or if people seek justice and compassion, if you don't do it in your communities, obviously look at our culture. People are going to seek to do it somewhere else. I think it's going to be more fruitful and much more aligned with the kingdom, more long lasting if it's done in the kingdom. So how would you create space for the word to influence that? So there's a danger. Like one way to say it's like, well, it makes me nervous, so I'm not going to deal with it. But what you're doing is by cutting off that space in your community or the places you lead, it's actually going to squirt out elsewhere. And then you've got another problem. Right. Maybe, and that comes from just, experiencing campus ministry and church ministry. Like, what that's like, those who lead those communities, like you don't create spaces for the prayer ministry or that kind of healing ministry. If you don't, then they start going to other ministries to learn about it. Or they'll create issues in your own community. They'll start creating division, saying you don't care about this stuff. And there's a way that these three circles, word, deed, and power, work together and can guide each other to a more holistic view of the mission. And I think that's key.
It is. And you mentioned another part of it where you said, because in my circles, I find that very word-centered, but I also find that people are very bored, meaning that they're just kind of coasting along. They're in their spiritual kind of complacency. They got all their comforts. And there's not a longing. I mean, there is like an internal longing for more, but they go to the churches and the churches are just trying to, in many ways, just trying to stay afloat. I mean, they're trying to manage all of the different things going on culturally. And I just don't see the focus on prayer meetings. I don't see the focus on encountering God. I see, and I hate to say this in some circles, not all, but more of a manufactured joy. And there's this, we're going to just kind of drum it up rather than just a byproduct of true revival. And I remember reading an article some time ago where they said we've traded prayer for posting online. And we've traded spiritual practices sometimes for protest. Now, sometimes there's necessary for protest. I'm not saying there's not, but oftentimes we go to the external rather than go into your Father and pray to your Father who is in secret, and he will reward you. And in our very kind of narcissistic branding culture, I mean, it just is what it is. I feel like we've got a lot of activity, but I remember hearing a pastor from Northern Ireland say years ago, we're like a bird in a cage, a lot of activity, but no progress. And yet it seems like if we're ever going to advance, we have to recover that heart for God. And I mean, because we can't do it ourselves. And you guys talk about that. You actually mentioned consecration, something that I don't hear very often in the circles that I've been in. Why the focus on consecration and putting oneself at the availability of God to touch and move? Well, I mean, why consecration again? What brought that up?
Yeah, it's the entry. The consecration marks the 4 C's that we talk about in the book. Consecration, calling, contending, and character. And it really is that
very pastoral right there. Very pastoral. I'm going to steal that.
That's right.
And give you no credit.
Presbyterian father.
That's right. You got all the alliteration right there. And then you got to do it like, Jesse Jackson. Then you go, we got consecration. You got to do that. And then we got calling, and you keep going. So
that's right. I
mean, keep going. So consecration.
So yeah. And so it is the entry place. It's an admitting that what you're experiencing right now is not what you're meant for. It's an admission that there's a gap between what life in the kingdom could be and where you're at. And there will always be this gap on this side of heaven. But it is a place where we say, for this season, I want to be set apart. And just sort of like any consecration, when you're consecrating the items for the temple, or you're consecrating people, you're basically just saying, I'm setting this apart for this season, and say, God, all right, it's creating a space or a room for God to speak more clearly and more powerfully. And it's that, right? That's the sort of the litmus. Like when we talk about even power, one way, the entry place for us in university is it's about listening. That's all we're asking people to do is, do you listen to God? Like one litmus test I often have is like, well, when people are saying like, well, my spiritual life, it's not very strong, or I'm not feeling very vibrant. I say, well, when was the last time God spoke to you that you understood? And that doesn't necessarily mean like an audible voice, just a sense that God gave you some direct connection. And those who are vibrant, they've got something in the last 2 months they could talk about how God said this, or spoke to this, or spoke through that sermon, or through this song. There's something about God speaking through that. And then for those where it's just dried up, it's been like years since they heard something from the Lord, which is kind of nuts, right? Like if you think about how we, at least in evangelical circles, we talk about a relationship with God. And yet in practice, we make it more about a philosophy of life, these principles and these rules that we follow. But the relationship, if it's a relationship, and this is Dallas Willard speaking, right? If it's a relationship, shouldn't there be two-way communication? Because we would never settle for a relationship that's just one way. And so what would it look like for us to have those spaces where we're not just reading the word, but the word reads us, right? It's a place where we're listening to sermons, but it's not that we're just hearing it and comprehending it. We are sensing what God is saying through that for us now. And that's important.
But how do you differentiate? I read a book by Mark Jobe, who's the president of Moody Bible Institute. He wrote a book just recently on kind of just discerning the will of God for your life. It's a short little book, very similar to another book that just came out by Michael Lindsay, who's going to be the new president of Taylor University, called Hinge Moments. Great book. But Job talks about hearing God's voice, and he tells about being a young pastor and got called out to Hollywood when Prince of Egypt was getting ready to be released, and they got to actually go and get a hearing watch it before everybody else did, because it was a bunch of religious leaders. And they said they heard from the director, and the director said the most strangest scene, or the scene they had the most difficulty with, was Moses at the burning bush. And they said because they couldn't figure out what to do with his voice. And I remember hearing that, because when I heard, not from them, but I remember watching the movie, and Val Kilmer plays Moses, and you hear Val Kilmer's voice come out of the burning bush. And that actually bothered me. But Job said, well, that's really how it is. God speaks through that. And oftentimes it's the voice that God speaks to. So how do you differentiate, being my Baptistic roots here? How do you differentiate between it's just your flesh talking to your voice, or just that's God? How do you know that when that's God?
That's a great question. And that can be a teaching on its own. But if I'm trying to locate it, it really is familiarity. There's like right now, like if I were to ask the listeners to close their eyes and then ask, oh, who's speaking to you right now? Well, and it was like, well, it's you, James. Well, because I've been introduced. We've been hanging out for the last half hour, but we already have enough familiarity where you can recognize my voice. And it does seem then Jesus seems to be making that kind of promise in John 10, right? This idea where the sheep will know the voice of the shepherd.
Yeah.
And it's an old ancient Near Eastern image of like there's a common sheep pen in most of these villages. So there'd be multiple flocks, and a shepherd would come up to the gate, right? And I don't know what a sheep call sounds like. I don't know. I don't know what it sounds like. But a shepherd would come up, right? And the sheep would self-sort. They would recognize the voice of their own shepherd and follow him out. And Jesus seems to be using this image of the variety of voices you can hear. You'll be able to recognize mine. I go, what? And that should be both like, what? That's crazy, but also the hope of what sustains us in the Christian life. So much so that I would say, like, well, isn't that the work of any disciple, any follower of Jesus, is to be able to recognize what God is saying in the everyday and to obey what we hear? Isn't that really the primary work of what we do? But okay, so that being said, how do you then recognize that and familiarity? Because familiarity doesn't sound like a great answer. You're like, well, give me some more. I do have 5 questions that I'll generally ask that help us get there. But I do think discernment's easier now than it used to be. Back in the Old Testament, and I got this from my friend Jordan Sang, who wrote Miracle Work, a great entry book if you're interested in sort of what it means to exercise spiritual gifts. It's a book for everyone kind of thing. But he talks about in the Old Testament, like God spoke to one person in a generation, right? So if that person said something that didn't come to pass, you were supposed to stone them, right? Because you needed to exercise like tight editorial control, right?
Yeah,
like that's,
big time.
Big time. But Joel 2, Acts 2, where is the Spirit located now? It's in the community of believers, right? And already poured out on us, which is awesome. And so much so that in 1 Corinthians 14, we have a sense that if someone speaks on behalf of the Lord, 2 or 3 should weigh what is said. There's a sense where community, I would think the main pillars being, what does the scripture say? And does this align with that? And what does the community say? And does it align with that? That discernment seems to be located now, not in one prophet in every generation, but in the community of believers. And that together, we can understand through scripture and through being together, that we can start to discern what God might be saying. And I wish I had that advice in my 20s. You know, I really did, because my friends would say stuff about like, hey, you know, you shouldn't, that relationship that you're in doesn't seem that good. You know, like they would sort of mention some things and I would go, never mind, because I heard from God. But I wasn't taking into account what my community was saying. Where I think it seems that discernment seems to be located there in some way. I also ask other questions like, if you heard something, you know, one test would be, does it produce faith or fear? And what would you do if fear was not involved? Because perfect love casts out fear, we know from 1 John. And so that's one question I love asking. What would you do if fear wasn't involved? Would you follow with what was being said? What would happen there? Another is the fruit. Does this produce more love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, or not? So scripture, community, fruit, faith, right? Those would be kind of the main kinds of things. And then that's not going to cover everything. That might cover like 90% of it. It's less about certainty. It's the old Flannery O'Connor quote. It's less of, don't expect faith to clear things up for you. It's not certainty. It is trust. And so it is that you trust. And when you hear, really one good way to go about it is to respond to it, sort of discern it in community, figure out, but do something about it. And once you do something about it, then see what happens and debrief and interpret that with the community. And it's in this, what we call our discipleship cycle in university, from hear, respond, debrief, that in that cycle, we keep learning how to hear God's voice together through the scripture and in community, and to keep growing in it. So that's the as short as I can make that answer. You can hear there's a lot of nuance in there, because there's a lot of abuse that can happen in this area.
Of course.
But we don't want to throw out the idea that God speaks to us just because other people have jacked that up, right? We were wired for this. We were meant for this. But I think sometimes our fear of getting it wrong keeps us from even trying in this area.
That's good. And you actually talk about the different, like you mentioned the discipleship cycle. You mentioned the U. I'm trying to remember how you guys exactly put that, but you caught that. You called that the breakthrough U curve. And they started off with number 1 was holy discontent, and that goes to number 2, which is untested faith, and then you go down to crucified hope. And I liked how you did that, because I thought really that's how it is, right? We get to this part where we do have a discontent, but our faith hasn't been tested yet. And then we do have it where it's kind of peeled away, where God, like I used to say that about seminary. Seminary is a bit like a spiritual chemotherapy, where it kills part of you in the hope that the other part does survive. But it's in that suffering, and where we have to learn really to hear the shepherd's voice. And you mentioned hearing God's voice. I remember hearing about C.S. Lewis and Mother Teresa both said as they got older, they didn't hear God's voice as much, because in many ways God was testing them still further. to discern more. You think you grow and hear more. And I think when we're young, we hear it so often, but as we get older, I feel like it shifts. Not that God intentionally does that with every single person, but I do think he's trying to strengthen our faith and our trust in the middle of that. So when you guys put this U curve together, what was the whole purpose behind that? Because you guys have a lot of different kind of figures and graphics to kind of build around, but what's this U curve that we can kind of grab a hold of?
Yeah, no, it's there because you see it in history, especially these histories of revivals, and we just felt like it was an important dynamic to bring out. For instance, like if I hear something from the Lord in my 20s, I used to think like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. It's going to be like open doors, green lights all the way down. God's, flush, all the resources are going to come in. It's going to be amazing. Thank you, Lord. Right. That's what we hope in our 20s when we hear direction for our lives, that it's just, everything's going to be incredible and beautiful and easy. Right. Because God's with us. So it'll be a lot easier.
Right.
Now in my 40s, if I hear the Lord speak that clearly about something I'm supposed to do, I brace myself. You know what I mean?
Like, grab a hold.
The question I'm asking in my head is, why did God think I needed to hear it that clearly?
Oh, yeah.
Because it's probably going to get harder before it gets easier. And that's just true. Like that's the breakthrough U curve. It's really trying to help people sort of locate where they are and to build grit and perseverance and trust in the Lord when it gets hard, because you're going to hear something. And if it's glorious and if it's of the Lord and of the kingdom, it will have opposition. Right? It will take trust to see it through. And so we do see like that pattern of people going up to their untested faith, and they get really excited. And as a leader, your temptation is just like, hey, hold on, youngster. I've seen this before. You definitely, we've been through the ropes. Don't dream so much. Your dreams are going to die. You're just feeling it. It's just like, it's miserable.
But you illustrate that with the wedding, right? Like you talk about a couple getting married, and I was like, oh, that hurts. Cause my wife's like, oh, that's you. And I'm like, cause you talk about it like, cause I'm one of those, I'm getting to be that crotchety old guy. Get off my lawn. I'm getting to be that guy, and I'm trying not to be. But you mentioned that in the book, and it's like, okay, you see this couple and you don't sit there and walk up to them and go, this is just, it's not going to be like this forever. You're going to have a lot of hard. Don't celebrate right now and be in the joy of the moment.
You have no idea what you're getting into, right?
I was dying. I was like, this illustration sucks. I was like, darn it. I don't like this right now. So
right. It's for us. It's for people our age. The Xers need to hear that, because we want people to be real and authentic and know the truth. But no, it's so cynical to do that. We should be stoking the dreams that they need those kinds of dreams to get through, to begin. And then God will take you through it where he's refining it, and you hit that crisis of faith. And with any breakthrough, you just see people going through that crisis moment.
Yeah.
And this is God sort of saying, it's not you. You don't get to be in control, right? And then we use a phrase that we took from Danny Silk, who leads it at Bethel, that it's a place where God kills our expectations, right? And raises expectancy. That's a big deal. Like expectations say, God, you got to show up this way or you're not good to me. Expectancy says, I trust in you and your hope. Make it come however you want. Expectancy, right? Says like, if we don't make this here, then God didn't show up. It just forces the hand, where expectancy is open and flexible to the will of the Spirit. And so it is a place where it crucifies your hope gets crucified. You enter into this place where then you have to ask, is this worth it? Did God really speak to me? You're asking all those questions. And so a lot of these revival leaders went through those doubts. It wasn't like revivals are messy almost across the board. And sometimes we have these pictures that are more fairy tale than reality about what revivals are. Like they're awesome and everyone loves the Lord and everyone loves each other and it's perfect and it's heaven on earth. It comes with a lot of opposition, a lot of criticism. People like wonder what's happening over there. There's people are wondering whether you should lead it. There are people who are thinking of leadership. There's a constant struggle there, and the Lord is refining us and our desires in it. so that if we make it through that crisis of faith and don't stay in that loop of despair, then we can come out the other side, right? With and seek breakthrough. And I just, it's almost intuitive when Ryan was the one who sort of showed that graph. That just felt really intuitive and helpful for people who God just puts a big dream on their heart. In business speak, that's an adaptive change, right? It's such a tremendous dichotomous challenge that revival callings tend to be just so much bigger than your typical ones, that those almost invariably require that walking through the crisis and letting God sort of take you to the next place. And so it was a way just to say, look, it kind of is our extra way to tell people, hey, glad you got that dream. We are kind of being that guy. We are sort of being that guy a little bit to say it'll go down before it goes up. But we hope that it's a hopeful thing to say, because we let you know ahead of time, then it gives you the strength to persevere and to build grit. And they'll ask God to meet you in that place when you're at the bottom, so that he might take you to breakthrough.
Do you think, I mean, you've worked with college students now for years and years. I mean, you've been in pastoral settings, you've been in college settings. Do you think that younger people, I mean, we just know that younger people are more willing to take risk. And you mentioned that in the book, like if you want to take a step of faith, and it's spelled RISK. And do you think this is something that older people have a harder time with?
Actually, I think so the millennials, so people in their like mid-20s to mid-40s, mid-20s and 30s, they'll take the risk. They're more willing to take the risk. This new younger crew that are in college now, they're much more risk averse. They don't want to take the risk. They want to live the right kind of life. What's the most excellent kind of life? And so they're different. And a lot of our campus ministers, our millennial campus ministers, are struggling. They're like, I don't understand this generation. Because the millennials were like a ready, fire, aim kind of generation, like, yeah, here's the vision, here's the mission, let's change the world. They're like, yeah. And then they're back like, what in the world are we doing? iGen's like, but how are you going to get there? What's the plan? Do we have any experts helping us with this? Because they've got access to YouTube. They've got access to experts all the time. They really are much more risk averse. Interesting. Than the new jack, than the previous generation in college. So no, I think it just depends. Xers, people like in their like late 40s to early 60s, those folks, we were risk takers. We were always questioning everything the boomers did. Like, what, you want to do big church? Forget that. We're gonna do this other thing. There's a reason why the .coms shows up with the extra leadership, right? They are the generation that tends to rebel and innovate and take lots of risk. Millennials also more willing to take risks. The iGens or Gen Z, much less willing. And so no, you're just meeting each generation where they are.
That's crazy. Hearing that, I'm like, we took a lot of risk, but there was a reason there was a .com burst bubble burst. Yeah, sure. That's right. Now, going back though, you mentioned the other one of the other C's was contending, and you mentioned one part of it, like you get, one of the things I like about it is that you guys get real practical. You would talk about calling out, contending day and night, and then you have like things in here. I'm just going to read it. Open your schedule, do mornings and evenings, start small, build gradually, have rest days and long days, print it out. I mean, one of the things that we try to do here is we try to say, like, here's your water bottle. So like, take this away. This is what you're going to sip on for the week as we're watering your faith. But it seems like you guys are doing that all the time through this. Like, you had a lot of diagrams through the book, and ways to visualize. But here you're giving really practical. Why is it so important to really just give these practical tools? I mean, and why did you put that in the book?
Yeah, because revival, right? It's such a big word, and you go to the big dream, and then without going like, but what does that mean today? What are our steps now? There's a huge gap, and besides, let's pray for it. We don't really know what to do next. So we really wanted to take that to a place where we could have some accessibility. Like, this is our next step. This is where we're gonna go. This is how we can long together. And we just felt that was really important because one thing we know, right? Revivals always start small. right? It's a number. Revivals always start small, and then they sort of catch fire from a group of people, and they go on from either relational angles, and God could do that with a bunch of different groups at the same time and bring them together, but they always start small. So that's one thing to pay attention to, is that mustard seed. And I think that's true. The other kind of obvious thing that we say is no revival happens without revived people. Right? We just like that almost seems so obvious, but then you got to think about like, oh, if we want to see revival, then we've got to ask revival to start with us. So much so, right? Gypsy Smith, the old quote was like, when asked about revival, he said, go into a closet, close the door, draw a chalk circle around yourself, and ask God to start revival within that circle. And I think it's that idea then. So how would you do that? Right? How would we ask God to start revival in us? That's where we're breaking it down. Consecration. Here's some things you can do. Seek the calling that the Lord has put in your heart. Okay, now that you're in this, how do you contend and keep laboring away? Because it's at that place that if revival doesn't show up for you, right, in that next 3, 5, 10, 20 years, what is our posture? What do we do in the meantime? And what keeps us going?
Because you mentioned again the movement, and I mean it's a new normal that you mentioned that's there, and how is that a new normal different than staying on the mountaintop? Because we all know that we got to come off the mountaintop and go into the valley, but how's the new normal differentiate from the mountaintop experience?
Oh, fascinating. It's probably the difference, as we were talking about what Prince of Egypt, the difference of the burning bush and then sort of creating the society as they're going through the desert. The Torah, the rhythms, how we're going to do this. What does this look like in practicality? You're still following what you heard on the mountaintop, but it's got teeth, it's got rhythms, it's got structure. That's why we talk about the mystery and strategy, why you got to hold both. And other writers on movements talk about how you need both. You need the sail to catch the wind if the wind were going to blow. You need both structure and strategy, the strategy, and the mystery. How do those things go together? So, there's moments where you on the mountaintop, you hear what God is asking you to do. You hear the call. You've consecrated yourself. You've heard it, and now you're doing the integration. You got to come back down, right? And as you come back down, what does it look like then to dig in and to go deeper and to let those rhythms sink in? And that's really, with us with InterVarsity, we heard this call 4 years ago. The whole national movement is seeking, we're longing for revival. That's actually what we call it, to 2030. And now what are the rhythms for that? What does that mean? How do we integrate that? Well, how does that change our leadership practices? It is these kinds of questions that get kind of strategic again. How do you make this stuff concrete enough so that others can join you if they were invited in?
Do you feel like, I mean, you mentioned for InterVarsity, and I can hear some of our listeners are going, hey, these are college students. You're talking about revival among college students. Do you think that churches, I mean, we know that they need these practices, but I'm sensing, I don't, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe it might be the circles I'm interacting with, but I'm not sensing a lot of churches pleading for revival anymore. I see them fighting, instead of a spiritual battle, they're fighting a political one, often talking about masks. They're talking about all the different politics that are going on. How do we change that narrative?
Oh, that is the Lord. Such a big thing to change the heart. No, and I think that's true. I think we do have pockets that are talking about revival. And our community, our staff go, all the way up to age 69, 70, 71, as well as we serve students and faculty. So there's sort of a mix there. But it's that revelation. Have we lost our first love? I think I keep wanting to go back to love. And it's such an old school word. You don't even hear a lot of either talks or themes or people just talking about love, because it feels so like, oh, God's love. Sure. Right. It doesn't feel, I don't know, Herculean. There isn't like a sense of kind of vigor in it, but it's gotta be the ground. And I just wonder, we've chased after other loves, potentially, like either political power or our vision of some other kinds of things, rather than falling back in love in this relationship with God. And that love fueling devotion, not white knuckling things, not like just trying to get our will engaged, but man, that sense that we had when we first met our spouses, that sense when we first, not that we can always feel that level all the time, but there's got to be some moments in the relationship where you're like, you know what, I just love her because I just love my wife, you know, and there's a genuine affection that's there because you have a healthy relationship. What would it mean to be for us as an American church to return to a first love? Just return first love, back to basics. I have Jeremiah 6:16 sitting on my desk, right? It's thus says the Lord, stand by the roads and look and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is and walk in it and find rest for your souls. And the next line is, but you would have none of it, right? Like, and Jeremiah understood his audience.
Do this, but you're not going to get it.
You're not going to do this. But
you're not going to do it, but it's what you should do.
I just think in a time when culture now is trying to take the moral high ground on us, we're in a post-Christian society. And the difference between that and pre-Christian society is that this culture is evangelizing us as much as we're evangelizing it. In a culture like that, I just think rather than seeking relevance more and more, which is what we did for a long time, right? Seeker-sensitive churches sort of make it really accessible to everyone. What if we sought the remnant, the ones who are really like committed and stoking the kind of faith that wasn't just easy, but something that found love and devotion at its center again? I like how Dallas Willard would put it is grace is opposed to earning, but not effort.
Yeah. I saw that in the book. You have a whole thing on it.
And that's,
Explain that.
Yeah. I mean, we're not trying to get into a place where you're earning your way into heaven. That's not the Bible at all. But there is a sense that in going that far in Protestant circles, then we go like, well, then we don't have to do anything at all. There's no effort needed. Jesus did everything that is needed. So we just sort of coast, kick back. When Jesus seemed to be saying, you know, if you want life, you kind of have to die.
Is your face right now? If you want life, you kind of have to die.
He doesn't seem to mince words. You want to be great. Be the servant of all. You want to find your life? You got to lose it.
Yeah, here's a cross. And there's a Take up your cross.
There is a taking up of the cross. There's effort involved, right? There's effort. There is a place where we give all of ourselves to Jesus. It's not earning our place in heaven, right? It's just we're working out that salvation He's already given to us. And I just wonder if we've just lost that. We just went, you know what? I get to live my life plus Jesus. You know, I've got my ticket to heaven per se. So when I get to the barcodes of heaven, boop, I'm in. Right? Like, thanks for the sticker.
That's so good.
But
it's like an iPad.
Maybe there's more, right? Maybe there's more. If the word saved in the Bible is being saved and healed and delivered, right? It just depends on the context what that means. Then we're not just saved, we're being saved, and we will one day be saved. Right? And so what if then we knew not just what we were saved from, but what we're saved for? And let that inject our faith again, so that we're not just remembering what has been done, but God is speaking His life and words into our community, so that we know how to respond now as we have front row seats to when God is making all things new. And I just think we've lost those pieces of salvation, and we've sort of made our services more of a memorial.
Yeah,
things dead.
Well, that, and I think people have such a limited view. Like you mentioned, how we're saved, we're being saved, and we will be saved. You know, from the penalty of sin, from the power of sin, and then the presence of sin. And it seems to me that we've got most of our people have this idea of just the decision. Just give me the first step, give me the liability, give me the fire insurance to get me into heaven. And there's so much more that's involved in that. And And I like how you're drawing that out, because you talk about holistic discipleship, and that's what we're advocating, what we call missio holistic discipleship, where it's all of life under the authority of God is used to display God's glory in the middle of all this. And that's what you guys are advocating for. You're saying we want to see all of life, and we want to see the church revived. Now, in seeing the church revived, and we talk about the church in America, and right now, though, the church in America is very divided. And you mentioned Ivy's work in talking about multi-ethnic ministry all the way back into the 1940s, which were really pioneers in that. And yet we're seeing in many ways the church divided along. I mean, there are a lot of multi-ethnic churches, and thank God for that, because I'm a huge advocate of that. But we're also seeing a lot of division along racial and cultural lines. Do you think that really, I mean, your book could be used in some ways to really bring people together in that regard? Because we all worship those who claim to be followers of Jesus. My hope is that we're all worshiping the same Jesus, because it's only through him that we're going to find really this allegiance. Is that also what you guys are hoping to accomplish by something like this? Or was that in your purview? Or is that just something like, hey, we see this going on, and really God's the only hope here?
I mean, God is the only hope. If our book has a small part to play in it, that would be great. But that's our hope. I mean, that's why we have word, deed, and power together. And we have to find ways that what that does is it allows a unity, because our primary identity is in Jesus, but it also allows for a diversity. And how are we able to kind of operate in that diversity as well? And both are needed. You go to the extremes where, like, let's just ignore all our differences. Well, then you never address Acts 6, Acts 15, like these places where there's some real kind of lines that divided. But what's cool is that the apostles didn't go like, that's just the left, or that's just the right. They went, this is us, so let's address it, right? And they then put Greeks in charge of the food distribution, right? Empowered them, these Jewish leaders. And then in Acts 15, just made some changes in the way you're welcomed in the church, so that it could be more welcoming to people who weren't Jewish. Just there's a we to it, but we're listening to the differences. And as we listen to that, to go like, well, then how do we respond together? I think is a key thing, because where there'd be one part of the community, like, we're just ignoring the pain that we're in, then that's not a true unity. You're ignoring the injustices that we're feeling. That's not a true unity. But if we say, no, we see that, let's address that together, and not be divided, then there's a way that, maybe the ministry of reconciliation, it was us and God in Romans, but also that reconciliation with each other in Ephesians and other parts of Paul, where it's just Jew and Greek. There was a way that this was supposed to reconcile us to each other too. And it is the hope. That's what it's word, deed, and power for those reasons. And we purposely chose revival examples from around the world. That you see that our American examples, a lot of revivals write about the Great Awakenings, or books on revivals talk about that. We really tried to touch more on things around the world.
Yeah, Pyongyang, you mentioned that. You mentioned India. You mentioned
East African revivals.
Yeah.
India, because you'll see that in those places, word, deed, and power came together. At Pyongyang, for instance, it was a time when the Japanese were oppressing Koreans, and would later, about within 8 years, begin to occupy Korea. So they were already in that way of doing it. So there was a lot of hatred in the Korean church against Japanese oppressors. And during the Pyongyang revivals, they also sought to address those injustices in nonviolent ways, but also to forgive their oppressor. And somehow we're able to do both. There was places where people stole from each other, and they were called to reparations and to pay back what they stole. It was a pretty fully orbed kind of thing that was happening in Pyongyang. That was word, deed, and power. These things that were happening all together. And we just wanted to highlight the ways that played out. Some of it playing out in the East African revivals, and how that affected either governments or other kinds of institutions. It's not going to be perfect. You could always point to things that are wrong, but we wanted to expand revival to just beyond conversions, that kind of a revival has a way of spilling out into redeeming society. And when we see them coming to their fullness, like abolitionist movement and how its connections to revival movements, all these kinds of things that are a part of the history, but we just sever them because we want to view spirituality in one bucket and then sort of social issues in another bucket. And actually these kind of in the kingdom, those weren't separated before the 20th century in the Christian faith. And the ways that bring those together, I think is key. And I think having then, if we can have these kinds of things where we're keeping them together in our time, maybe we can then help those who see it just about where we go when we die to see that there's this other component, or for those who just see it as a justice movement to say there's a spiritual component that's really important too, and bringing those together in his name.
Do you think that the diversity of the American church allows some of those issues to be brought out more fully because each culture has a tendency to approach from a certain milieu or genre, if you will, to certain issues? Like I see within the Latino church, the issues of liberation and oppression and brought in and justice. And then I see other cultures bringing a different element to that. Do you think then that's, I mean, one of the things that we should build off of for this kind of idea of a beautiful community coming together and learning from one another, and that helps us to get a fully orbed gospel? And without that diversity, our gospel is still there, but in many ways is somewhat diminished, in that we can't take the full essence of its diversity without that around us, provided we are in a community that has that type of diversity at the same time.
Agreed. I think that's true. And I also think even if your community doesn't have that diversity in and of itself, that's why we have the body of Christ connecting to communities that are not like yours. So in one sense, I know it's frustrating for some because they might say like, well, my church has to be fully multi-ethnic. And that would be great if it was. But if it's not, or you're just not in that kind of community where that's a possibility, then what are the other avenues that you're creating for places for connection and to learn from a different group? Because there is some power in being apart, and there's some power in being together. And if there's ways that can come together in its best way, for example, does the civil rights movement happen without the Black church? Now, and I'm stepping into waters, not as a historian, so I do need
not
to
as Jesse Jackson out of high school.
Right. I gotta be careful. There's a lot of sin involved on why the church is divided the way it is.
Yes.
But some of the ways that might be redeemed is that it's paying attention to other things so that we can bring that together. And then as the Black church led in the civil rights movement, they invited other communities to be with them. And I think there are places where maybe is like the Sunday hour, is that going to be the best place for us to learn from each other and connect? It might be for some. But it also might be like the missions trip we're doing together, or the service projects we're doing together, or the places where we have more time to interact with each other, where we're really doing some good learning. And InterVarsity does some of that modeling. We might have some ethnic specific ministries, we might have some multi-ethnic ministries, but there's some commitments if we're on a particular campus to do retreats and missions trips and service projects together, or outreach together, while also having spaces where we're dealing with our own stuff too. And so it is more like being one, unity and diversity, having both. And so I just think there's different models out there on how that could play itself out, as long as the leaders, we all see like this is actually one thing and not separate things.
Let me change gears just for a second, because talking about revival, I was chatting with Os Guinness. I mean, he's 80 years old. He's written 30 some books, just kind of this elder Christian statesman in the community. And he's hoped for a Christian renaissance of sorts. And I had mentioned that to him, and he goes, no, I'm hoping for revival. And I thought, wow. He said, I come from the generation where I watched John Stott sitting in the corner right before he went out to preach, on his face, pleading before God to awaken and be in him preaching. And I was struck by that. I wasn't expecting that from him, because I had just read, and we read a lot in what we're doing, but I read Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies, and a book he had written called The Benedict Option. And in many ways, he's calling for a strategic retreat from culture. And because of how it's become so, in many ways, the faith has become compromised. And it's become where Christians are having a harder time engaging in the culture with a good conscience in some ways. And I'm curious on how do you respond to, and I don't know if you've probably read the book or not, but just that idea or concept, because you're saying we want revival, but it seems that we're in a post-Christian culture. We get the stats that the church is decreasing for the first time in 80 years. Membership's gone below 50% level. Of course, we see evangelicals, younger evangelicals have no problem with cohabitation and living together and those kind of things. And yet we have the LGBTQ, all of the different things that are going on right now. How do you engage this younger generation and just people in general in this concept of revival? I mean, yes, I read it. I'm a fan of it, but yet I look at the stark realities that are staring me in the face in my own tribes. And I'm saying, okay, Lord, this is a revival that has to be you. Because I can't do this. I can't fight these battles. This has to be you. And I want to be faithful with where I'm at. But how do you respond to that kind of idea and thought process and place where we're at in society right now?
No, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And that's what I mean by the remnant. And you'll hear a lot of people kind of in these revival circles talking about the need for the remnant. It is a strategic temporary retreat.
Elaborate on the remnant here for a second. I mean, I know biblically, but elaborate that for our listeners. What do you mean by that remnant idea?
Yeah, and I'm posing that idea to the idea of relevance. So remnant in the scripture, right? It's Elijah on Mount Carmel. He's had this crazy victory, and then now he's in the caves.
The broom tree first when he wants to pass out, and he says, "I'm no different than he's got to rest," and then he goes into the cave.
Right. Yeah, that's right. The rest, and it's there that sort of God reminds him. Actually, I've got a remnant. I've got like 7,000. I've got people.
Yeah.
They're the ones who have not bowed the knee to Baal. You didn't know they were there, but they're there. These folks who are devoted, even though culture's gone the other way. And that's the idea of remnant versus relevant, right? Relevant is sort of the community that's you're trying to make the connections with culture in order to like make the gospel appealing or understandable. So this didn't make the book. I wish it did, because it came to us afterward.
Awesome. It's awesome. Second book, volume 2.
Yeah.
Volume 2.
It was volume 2. So what we do is we do a 2x2 grid. InterVarsity loves our 2x2 grids, where we put remnant and relevant. Whenever we see like two opposing ideas, we wonder if it's more like a 2x2 grid rather than in opposition. Because right now, that's what it's being talked about. We went for relevance before. We did these big kind of events, rock bands, try that stuff. We sort of, and that might have worked when we were more in a Christian culture where there was more foundations and more grounding. People understood the scriptures more. There was more authority given to church leaders, that kind of stuff. So that, but now that we're in this space, maybe we need to push more into the remnant. And so a lot of people are saying, ditch the relevance, go to remnant. What we're trying to say is actually, what would it look like to be high relevant, high remnant in this 2x2 grid? Because what that would do is that's actually the place of influence. That's actually where revival happens, is where relevance meets remnant. And so this is what we actually say: to get to high relevance and remnant, in the past, we went through the relevant side of things, right? We made these kind of, met in movie theaters. We sort of created rock, contemporary worship. We had services that used non-churchy language. When I was for example, when I was in college, right? If you had friends who weren't Christian, you were like in Christian circles, like, whoa, you have friends who aren't Christian? You're so cool, man. That's crazy. It was pretty unheard of. You kind of hung out with other Christians.
I'm laughing because it's so true.
It's so true, right? And what you would do then, right, for young people at the time was you wanted to send them out. Like, go to the fraternity, go to the dorm, go to that club, be relevant, right? Send them out so that they'll be salt and light in those places. And more often than not, they could be an influence. If they're sent and community supported, they're an influence on the community that they're sent to. Nowadays, if we just send people out, we don't know if they're coming back.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? Because the culture is evangelizing us as much as we're trying to evangelize.
I love that, by the way, that description. Culture evangelizing us. That's good.
Totally, right? So then we can't just send them out because they don't seem to have the same grounding or the foundations or the culture, even the supports of a vestigial Christian culture, right, is not there. So we actually need to go deeper with them, to teach them what it means to be committed, to persevere, to stay faithful, and to call people to commit. It is so hard for iGen to commit. The young people, so hard for them to commit. You've heard of FOMO, fear of missing out. Mark Sayers, in his book, he talks about FOBO, fear of better options. And I think that's so true. We can't even get our young students to commit to like coming to a Friday gathering because they don't know if another better option might show up on Friday night. So they're not committing to our meeting. They're not committing to anything else until like the last moment. I was like, I guess I have nothing better to do. I'll come to large group or I'll come to the gathering. So our staff are even doing these spontaneous things. They're making it look like a spontaneous Bible study, but it's been planned. But they're asking people then, because that's how you kind of deal with the FOBO, is really, the people have a hard time with committing. But the thing is, right, commitment is inversely related to meaning, right? So if you, like in your value for you don't commit because you value your freedom so much. But if you don't commit, you'll never have meaning, right? Like our relationships, for example, right? Like our most important relationships, let's say a marriage, it's a commitment to one person. And in that commitment, you're actually saying no to 1,000 other people.
Yeah, you guys talk about that. We all make these choices over and over that continually they limit your options. You're intentionally limiting yourself. Like when you get married, you're saying, I'm saying no to all those other people. I do this. Right. I'm saying no. So you guys talk about that in the book, but I keep going. I love where you're at.
So in like, when you make those kinds of commitments, that's how you find meaning in relationships, in society, and communities. It's when you commit. Right? So consecration is like one way to seek commitment. You're actually saying no to a bunch of things so you can learn to commit again. And this is what we're trying to teach our folks. So in the past, instead of making people become relevant, we're pushing them more the remnant direction, right? To say, what does it mean to go deeper so that when you go out there, we don't lose you? One great example, right? Like sort of sexual ethics, that kind of thing. Like back when we were in college, right? Like we would get comments like this, like, whoa, you don't do what until you're married? That's crazy. Dude, I could never do that, but I respect you for it.
Right. Yeah.
I respect you for it. So there was a sense of like, that feels unattainable, but there was at least cultural respect for Christian sexuality. Now, fast forward 40 years, 30 years later, right? What's Christian sexuality look like now, right? It's intolerant, it's bigoted, it's old-fashioned, it's hatred, it's all of this, it's bigotry. And so now, where before culture might have given us the moral high ground, it's flipped. Anymore.
Yeah, which is weird. So weird.
Right? But that's so just weird. True across the board. Culture thinks it's better than Christians. Now, a lot of that's our fault.
Yep, there's a lot of scandals.
A lot of that is our fault.
Yep.
So, and that's sort of why we need to recapture some of these things. It's more holistic. It's more fully orbed. It's word, deed, and power. It's kind of these pieces where instead of getting caught into these culture wars, maybe we can just show people that we're not against them. We're just in love with Jesus. And that just requires some other things. I think that's a missing piece right now. So yeah, this is kind of a long discourse to say we do need to push people toward commitment. We need to push people these days more toward finding faithful rhythms and communities to stick with you and you with them so that you can have the grit and perseverance to survive in a post-Christian culture before we even get to relevance. But we hope by investing in that other piece, then we don't want them to stay a holy huddle, right? That's the other issue.
Yeah.
So it's not that you don't want relevance. It's just you don't seek relevance first anymore. Because now everybody's these days, any young person, they have friends who aren't Christian. You're weird if you don't.
Yeah.
And how many times have you heard musicians, like young musicians, well, we're not a Christian band. We're a band that is Christian. That whole
Yeah.
Which I'm sort of being tongue in cheek about it, but there's a lot more, I think, allegiance. It's not quite the right word. The relevance is high. I would say relevance is high, remnant is low for Christians these days in America. And just such a different experience than like our Muslim background believers or others who just, it's all remnant, right?
Yeah.
But they still seek to be relevant, And it's not that they're shying away from preaching the gospel. It's not that they're shying away from these things. It's just, it has to go way deeper for them. And
do you feel like the church that, and I say the church, and I mean like the kind of the American, or let's say Western evangelical church, has failed to grasp this remnant idea because they've been the majority for so long? There doesn't seem to be a depth, but yet I'm sensing now that remnant idea is almost growing, where people want to grow, they want to go deeper, and they're willing to suffer. Some already are, but it seems to be there's a pruning going on, and that remove. I love how you contrast the relevance versus the remnant idea. But do you see this remnant idea growing in churches that, or even in the Christian groups that you're working with? Because you guys mentioned you work not just with IV, you guys are working across the board. I mean, you're working with Crew, you're working with other different groups that are out there trying to share the gospel and really, see God transform college campuses. And I was really encouraged by reading that in the book. But do you see that within churches as well? Have you guys heard that? I mean, what are you guys seeing?
Yeah, no, it depends on the church for sure. But yeah, like a growing interest. From some of the bigger churches that I'm connected with, like how much they were more interested in the power circle or sort of experiencing God rather than their programs. That was sort of the beginning of it, like 5-10 years ago. Now, but hearing a lot more about the remnant these days, because I mean, we're just seeing it. The attrition is high out there, and I think for those of the leaders who see hope in it. So there's a lot of Christian leaders that are like, oh man, this is the end, right? Like, they're going to take away all our privileges. Our tax exemption statuses are going away. There's a lot of things about that there, will be real costs to us. And yet at the same time, I just wonder if post-Christian culture is actually going to be good for the church as a pruning, as a cleansing, as a helping us kind of jettison things that aren't as important, finding our first love again. I just think there are benefits to not being in power. Christians in power don't usually do well.
We don't.
But when we're under the gun, man, that's where our faith comes alive. Not that I want to glorify the suffering at all.
No, not at all. I mean, and because there's also real danger. I mean, we talk about the blood of the martyrs as the seed of the church, but I had Philip Jenkins on the show, and he'd recently wrote a book called Fertility and Faith, but we actually talked a little bit about his book called The History of Lost Christianity, where he talks about places that were once bastions of Christianity that you can barely find a Christian there now because of persecution. So that's also a reality that I don't think the church often talks about. We do acknowledge persecution, and I think it's more of a nod, hoping that it doesn't come our way. And I find that some Christians are, while they see the benefit of persecution, they don't want it. And I mean, no one really wants persecution. I would hope we don't long to see people killed or hurt or things like that. But there is a purification aspect that you mentioned to that. And I do wonder though, how much the American church, we have, I think it was Pfeiffer, and I think you guys mentioned this in the book, where the problem isn't so much persecution, but it's apple pie. And it's in the good, and we're so close to the gifts and the comforts that we have. We really don't, we're allergic to suffering like my kid's allergic to peanuts, that type of thing. And we're, like, instead of gluten-free, we're persecution-free. Like, I'll take my Christianity persecution-free. Thank you very much. That's better for my diet.
Right. Yep. It's more Brave New World than 1984, right? More Huxley than Orwell. That's so true. And it's so, we're connected. We've become really like good friends with the Ethiopian movement and the Ethiopian student movement. And there was a time about 10 years ago where the American movement and the Ethiopian movement were the same size. We've shrunk, and the Ethiopian movement has blown up. They're sort of gangbusters. And so we went over there to learn, which was so much fun. I grabbed my team and we just said, we're not here to teach anything. We just want to learn. Fortuitous meeting with their general secretary of Ethiopia at a missions conference. And then he invited us out, and it was an amazing time. But, so when we look at what's happening, right, this movement of like, they're on every campus in their country, a movement of 50 to 60,000 now, with only like 70, 80 full-time staff. It's like crazy what the Lord is doing there. Suffering persecution in the North, right? They're having students by other Christians, Orthodox Christians, are throwing rocks at them as they share the gospel. They can't walk alone on campus for fear of violence against them. The police have been called on their meetings. Those kinds of things, where they're suffering real persecution, but then they have large groups that are 1,200, 1,500 strong, chapters that are 2,000. It's pretty incredible what the Lord is doing. So when we look at it, we go, revival's happening right now. This is what's happening right now, is amazing. And the general secretary just shook his head at us. He's like, no, it didn't happen. It's not happening now. It happened back when we were under communist oppression. And so he then locates revival in this place where the communists came in, right? This is I think the 80s, literally late 70s, early. They come in, and basically Christian church has to go way underground, particularly like the non-state church. They're just underground. They're smaller than they've been. They take some hits. I got to meet the general secretary, who was a secretary during that persecution in Ethiopia. But the way the GenSec would say it is, but I can't think of another time where we prayed more. And that time was a time when God gave us a heart for him. And that's where revival was born, was there when we were praying together, and I'm watching this movement. We just went through a day where they went through a whole day of a 6-day conference of fasting and praying together, right? It's not like these guys don't know how to pray. They absolutely do. And they were praying for their students who are persecuted in the North, right? And then they started a worship song that was written in the time of persecution to say it was like they considered a prophetic song, where the lyrics were, we were small, but we will be big again, something along that lines. And just how much courage it gave to their students. Like, you're looking at it and you're thinking, this is revival. And yet they locate it in the place of persecution, in the place where they were forced on their knees. And that's just my team, the American team. We're like, dang, what do you do with that? Right? It's not that you wish that, but there is something about that when you're just left to you no longer have any other cultural cachet or power to pull on. And it's just, at that point, who else do you depend on? What else do you do? Seems to be the right place to set you up for the upper room or Antioch and Acts 13 to say, okay, God, what do you want to do? And I just wonder how much space we give God. We have faithful communities, but in the American church as a whole, do we let him just call it, or are we just protecting our stuff?
I'm scared to answer that question. Sometimes, looking at our culture and knowing what I know, I mean, we hope to say one, but if we're really being honest with ourselves, how much of it is the other?
And I don't mean to judge us. I'm in this boat, right? I'm living that tension every day. So I don't want to come off like I know everything. But that these are the tension and the costs are real.
It is, and the costs are real. And it's my hope and prayer that God would use a book like yours and Ryan's to transform people and bring us back. Because honestly, I haven't read a book on revival in a long time. I mean, and they've been out there, and even when they're out there, they don't stay very long because there's not a lot of people purchasing them. And I just don't hear it in an evangelical circle. I mean, of course you hear it in such more charismatic circles, but it's in some ways, it's like we heard when we were kids, everything's revival, and it's more manufactured than it is actually a genuine article and a genuine revival. And I hope and pray that God would use this to spark revival in people. And you guys don't just leave it at individuals, you move it to communities and even going up the different zones, layers that you have. One of the segments we like to end with is, this is your water bottle for the week. Now, if we could say to our people, this is the water bottle that we want you to take home for the week, that are listening, and they're listening all over the world, what is the water bottle that you want to give them that they can just drink on in the week to come?
That's a great question. And I'm calibrating what level to bring it. My sense is it's in that level of consecration. I wonder if for those who are listening, if, as we've talked about consecration, that's been a tug, like a tug at your heart, and you're getting the sense that God might be saying, what if you set aside a time? It's not a permanent time. I'm not asking you to have a permanent rhythm that you stick to for the rest of your life, just a season, 40 days, 3 months, where you ask the Lord, is there something you want me to consecrate to you? Is there something in this next season where I can consecrate and say, this I either give up or do for this next season so that I could seek your will in my life? I just think for revivals to really have their sort of, to really have it, right? Like it's I do think it starts small, and I do think revivals start with revived people. And it just it took a journey for me to even embrace the concept. So I think my water bottle would be, is the Lord asking you to consecrate in this next season? And I just sort of will leave it open to that. Whether that leads to a sense of revival or what your place in it is, I don't try to determine for you. I just want to say, would you be willing, like whatever comfort, whatever thing that might be just there, just to say, that's not going to be mine for a while, so that I can make more space for God to speak. And my hope is that does something to restore our first loves. And from there, if you're hearing from the Lord, then I trust you're in his hands.
That's a good word, brother. That's a good word. I want to thank you for coming on the show and encourage those that haven't seen the book. It's through InterVarsity. We got a gift from InterVarsity. They let us have this book, but Longing for Revival. You can get it online. You can also follow you. Where can they follow you, James?
Sure. James Choung, just all one word, and most social media stuff. And then jameschoung.net is where you can find me online.
And you got other books too. What are your other books?
Yeah, the first one, True Story, Christianity Worth Living Out, is how to show the gospel more holistic. And the second book, if you're interested in the generational stuff that we talked about, that's in the second book called Real Life, A Christianity Worth Living Out. And that's a book on discipleship.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on Apollos Watered. I'm sorry I didn't get to hear your Jesse Jackson impression.
No, you don't want to hear that.
But God bless you, and may God take this book and really touch so many different lives. Thank you for coming on Apollos Watered, brother. Have a great day.
Thanks for having me, Travis.